Hi, I'm James Dean Vogel of the Bioprocess Institute, and this is Between Two Ferrules. Today our guest is James Hathcock. He is a Senior Director of Regulatory and Validation Strategy at the Pall Corporation. He's been a leader in the pharmaceutical, medical device, and technology transfer industries with extensive experience in quality systems, product lifecycle, manufacturing, supply chain, and R&D. James.
Hi, thanks. Great to be here.
Thanks for coming down from Massachusetts here to the Bioprocess Institute. We have some of your products here that maybe you can talk to a little later and kind of see things here. So I think the industry is in a great place right now. A lot of activity, a lot of things going on, and we want to get your view on a few of those things here. But I guess let's start off with, we're on the downside from the pandemic, hopefully, knock on wood. You know, things have, I think, opened up in a lot of ways. One of the big things that was a concern was supply chain and things there. Just maybe tell us some of your views from your perspective of what you've seen with things here in early 2023.
Yep. So a lot of good interactions and so forth, a lot of lessons learned certainly over the past few years from the pandemic, how to respond, have those supply chain mappings clear on the radar. There are a few publications coming from Bioforum where we work together as an industry to better articulate and get that out the door. We do see a lot of issues where there are inventory buildups, and now those inventories are being consumed, and the business is trying to readjust to work through those. But on the horizon, you look at the Bioplan and Associates surveys, the messages you hear, pharma is investing, and so the future is bright.
Absolutely, absolutely. So I know some people with the basic bolus in, let's say, the warehouses and so on, are even looking at things like extending shelf life and things like that. Have you seen any of that?
Yeah, lots of good discussion, especially during the pandemic, about systems were sitting on the shelves and they wanted to use them for the same purpose or a slightly different purpose. And how do you extend shelf life, and what does that really mean? And one of the key concepts that comes up is the suppliers will typically, they have their own ways of doing this, but they test performance and quality of components at the end of the shelf life. For us, that may be 3 years on a component post-irradiation or 2 years to claim on a single-use assembly. And what that means is you test to show that it meets those performance claims and specifications at that 2 years. It doesn't mean at 2 years and 1 day or at 2.5 years that it fails. It just means you've gone through the effort, the aging to test it and show this works as intended. And so when you talk about extending a shelf life claim, usually the suppliers can't say we extend it because we don't have the data to show that it works. Now, intuitively, we know these plastics are very resilient when stored properly in bags, in the boxes.
Right. They're in these bags here. They're usually double bagged or whatever when they're in the assemblies. Yeah.
Exactly. So what we can often do is help support the end user's risk assessment on what would happen. Right. So if it's a sterilizing grade filter, we don't have one here, but you could look at the materials of which it's made. Are you doing integrity testing of the device? What could go wrong? Would you capture it? And usually those types of arguments going into a risk assessment can really help you extend to meet those issues of the day.
It's great to know that the manufacturer has some of that information that can help the end user to make that decision. Because, you know, let's face it, you know, cost of goods and other things are becoming more and more of the vocabulary today. And so if they can extend that, especially if, you know, you had the pandemic where they stockpiled and then maybe now they have a little more budget constraints or whatever on their operation, they're able to get through that.
Right. I mean, the goal is always you want to help the end user get through and help make those therapies. So even when you can't extend officially a claim, you can say what goes into the risk assessment, what's important, what to look for to help them get past that hurdle.
Excellent, excellent. So kind of a related thing that I know you're very much involved with is we're looking at different modalities of sterilization. and we're using a lot of comparing the data between different types, and the shelf life, I'm sure, comes into that. Yep. So tell us a little bit about your efforts on X-ray and some of the things you're going. You've been a leader in that area for the industry.
Thanks, Jim. So absolutely. And when we first think of irradiation capacity out there, this depends on cobalt-60, which takes mined out of the ground, takes years to convert up to the right isotope from cobalt-59 to cobalt-60. And then to get it in the right location at the right contract irradiator where it's needed and when, that's a huge supply chain logistic piece to bring together. And to date, many of those have done it quite well. However, with the growth of single use, what we've seen during the pandemic, this has become quite challenging. And some of the contract irradiators, the way they're building out future capacity is in X-ray sterilization. X-ray is nothing new. It's been around since at least 2000. Right, it was a facility opened in the Maryland area back around 2000, but was then relegated to sterilization of congressional mail following the anthrax issue. And then in 2010, you had the Synergy Health in Daniken, Switzerland. It was the first medical sterilization facility on a commercial scale. So when we think of modalities, and that's a catchword, a buzzword, I like to use it when I first learned it, but now I think we use the word different sterilization technology. Okay. It's all ionizing irradiation, right? You have photons, whether it's from gamma rays or X-rays, go through, and then they're converted into electrons within the materials that do all the work. And so really it's the same fundamental principles of how this energy interacts with materials, and there's some great papers out recently demonstrating that. And we've been working through industry organizations such as BPSA, good discussions with Bioforum on what's needed, what are the right risk assessment requirements to qualify X-ray as an equivalent alternative. And really great discussions, working with the regulators, BARDA, the FDA has provided feedback, and we're having great discussions working through those risk assessments on what's needed, and we all see this being implemented in the late 2023 time period.
So the different type of processing, you know, with the different energy source, pretty much from the most part, have you seen either one type of material or some types of material where they've been affected differently, or from what you've seen, and I realize, you know, every case is specific, but have you seen any real differences between gamma radiation and X-ray?
It's a great question. And when we look at a lot of these materials, I mean, generally, if it's compatible with gamma irradiation, we're assuming it's the same fundamental physics and understanding, then we expect it to be compatible with X-ray. With irradiation, one of the key types of materials we're curious a little bit more about are these elastomeric materials, right? Because what's different about them is they become cross-linked, so you can have some stiffening and so forth in the material, but it's also degraded like a lot of other plastics are with irradiation.
They turn yellow and other things happen to them, yeah.
Exactly. So if we're looking and we're concerned that one material may be a little bit more different, then these tubings were high on the radar. However, a lot of the tubing manufacturers have done their studies looking at X-ray and gamma. They're publishing that as part of the second BPSA white paper on X-ray and gamma, and we're seeing the exact same performance characteristics.
Okay, well, that's good to know. That's good to know. That's it. If an end user is starting to evaluate this and what to do, any advice for them is how to go about this, or should they wait a little while, or is it time to get into it as an end user now?
Yeah, that's another really good question. And this is a business continuity risk, meaning waiting just increases the risk that that capacity may not be available. So that might impact you in delays of when you need your goods. Mm-hmm. So first step, look at those BPSA papers, get involved, listen and see what's happening. If you have a critical drug product that's at the tail end of the process where you want to implement X-ray is an alternative qualified technology, the most critical things you can do would be product stability studies, very limited scope, put your product in a very small scale bag. The different suppliers are making these available with X-ray and gamma. And go ahead and start that. And that's what builds your own confidence. For all of the other assays, following the BPSA quality test matrix of what to test, how to characterize connectors, whether it's soiling test, extractables, the suppliers are putting those data sets together and showing equivalence. But for you and your drug product, to build your confidence, there are materials available to go ahead and get you started.
Excellent. Okay, well, that's very good. Thank you for that summary. Okay, so then I know one thing that we've been talking about a lot is biocompatibility and some of the changes that are going on there. We've seen extractables, the USP has gotten involved with the release of the 665 standard, and that supplemented with the Bioform Group's extractables expectations has kind of balanced some things. And then the original version of the 665 had some, let's say, considerations for biocompatibility, and I know for a fact that, you know, terms like Class 6 plastics and all are going to sunset someday and are going to leave us somewhere. Any input on that from your view on that side?
Yeah, that's great, right? We know there's a lot of animal testing, and it's a hot topic within the industry, and there's a lot of testing that goes in when you look at the Class 6 testing. Very often, if I'm Paul and I'm manufacturing a new Presto connector, I'm going to look and say, are those resins evaluated? Because I don't want to spend years developing a product and then come to find out it failed some of those requirements. So you'll start to look at those data, but then after we manufacture our component, we'll need to irradiate it, test for those biocompatibility tests. We'll need to autoclave it, do the same testing. And if you look at an industry as a whole, that's a lot of animal-based testing. And if you really look at where those USB 87 and 88 requirements come from and how they're referenced in the chapters, we're looking at container closures, right? There's an animal implantation test that we all do when we say we're Class 6 tested.
Yep.
And does that make sense? We're not implanting any of these, right? And we want Class 6 for everything from your first plastic used in downstream process, as many clearance steps removed away from the patient. So clearly there's an opportunity for us to do better there. In the USP 665, you're absolutely right. We had a couple of different versions, I think up to 4 versions, where we put in 87 maybe for low risk and 88 for the higher risk, and it changed between those different iterations. And at the end of the day, we connected and could not reach consensus agreement within 665 about what should be where and why and how it should be worded. So it was basically taken out of scope. And if you chat with Desmond or USP, they'll say, those requirements are really geared for container closures and so forth. If the industry wants to get together and decide what's right for them and bring everybody together, absolutely. But we need to do it as an industry group. And so at the time that we stopped doing animal implantation tests, we fully support that, but let's come out with an industry white paper together so we don't disrupt our customers and the drug manufacturers and say, hey, why aren't you checking that box anymore?
Yep, and I think our cousins in medical device have seen things more change through AAMI and the ISO standards.
Yep.
So 10993 and Europe, from my understanding, is pretty much, you know, do animal testing by exception for what's going on in Europe.
Exactly. If you go to some of those places that we would historically do that USB 88 testing to a lab in Europe, they won't do it unless they have the proper rationale or justification for why that's needed. And not even from Europe, we're seeing these same questions from customers in Asia saying, why are you doing this? So it's coming, we just need to make sure we do it together.
Yep, absolutely, absolutely. One other thing that there's definitely been a lot of talk, and you and I are writing something on this right now, is PFAS. And it seems to be bubbling up very fast. It seemed to almost come out of nowhere, I think, and really hit us. So what have you been seeing with the PFAS topic? And maybe just a brief summary of what it is.
Yeah, so PFAS are forever chemicals. And it's a huge family of chemicals and materials, and depending on the definitions of them, it can include everything from these forever chemicals, more than 2,000 of these chemicals, to a lot of the materials that we use every day for like air filtration of aseptic connectors, for air filtration membranes, Teflon O-rings, PVDF O-rings, and so forth. And one of the first states to come up with a regulation was Maine. It's not huge pharmaceutical manufacturing in Maine, but they're using a law starting this year to say, tell us all of the materials you're selling and what the levels of potential PFAS molecules are in the materials you're selling. And I think they're using this as a way to collect information, right, from all of us. And it doesn't matter if it's in pizza boxes,
Single-use connector.
single-use connectors, fire foam fighting equipment, and so forth. They're all looking at it as a whole. I think the most challenging one, though, is coming from Europe, where on March 22nd of this year, they're starting a 6-month discussion on what's probably the most restrictive ECHA proposal to ever have been. And this includes both PVDF, PTFE, oleophobic membranes, and so forth. And so we need to jump in and have a say, because the way it's worded now, pharmaceutical process equipment or single-use equipment is not even mentioned or on the radar. So we need everyone to jump in, speak up, get it on the radar, then see how we can find a workable path forward so the environmental concerns are properly addressed, but patient therapies aren't compromised.
Exactly, exactly. I do think, though, and we can take maybe some lessons from our medical device colleagues and our food colleagues, because they were a little bit ahead of this curve and did get some notice with the folks in Europe about, some exemptions or at least postponement of that.
No, absolutely right. And I think we're good about seeing something's coming onto the radar, we start chatting about it, but pulling everybody together to say, hey, this is how it impacts us as an industry is a real challenge. There are great groups to do this through, but we have to speak up and get involved to do it.
Right. BPSA has some efforts. SME BPE is starting some things, and there are many other. I think Bioforum's going to start a group too.
Yep, I think within the next month they're starting a group as well. And keep in mind, you say there are derogations or kind of exceptions to the rule that are clearly stated for medical devices, but really all this is doing is pushing out the implementation timeline to about 13 years, which is still an incredibly short amount of time to figure out how you find alternatives to these technologies, which, let's face it, I mean, these are really unique features of some of these materials, so it's going to be really hard to find a replacement and then to qualify and validate that as well.
Absolutely. So this will be probably one of the bigger things in the room coming up, and the industry really needs to get mobilized. And like I said, we'll be publishing a paper on that soon, hopefully, to get some information out. But please use other sources, and we'll put some at the end of the video here that you can get some references to help you get up to speed. I understand that you're a robotics coach with the first Lego League. Can you give us a little info about what your experiences are with that?
So that was a fantastic experience we did for a few years. I think my girls were now growing out of that stage. But even in New York City during the pandemic, we'd have the big board with propane heaters out and snow on the ground in December. Right, and it's fantastic to see their minds looking at the programming, how they're coordinating things around the board. And they did fantastic, right? We won the New York City Championship.
Wow.
They did. They went to a virtual session during the pandemic in Greece. I think it was at a very awkward hour in school or right after school to come out. But absolutely a blast.
Excellent. Excellent. Great. What advice would you give to a young person coming into the biopharmaceutical industry now, whether it's an engineering student or a life science student or somebody entering in here, from your experience, your vast knowledge of the industry, and seeing it from your perspective? What advice would you give him or her?
It's a fantastic time to join, right? I see people here doing studies, and remember the time sitting back in the lab. Have fun. Enjoy it. Don't be afraid to make mistakes. Learn how things work, why things work. It may be a while before you get the whole big picture of how the industry is working, but this is where you learn what works and what doesn't. And you touch things, you try it. To me, it was one of the most enjoyable parts of my whole experience.
Excellent. Great. Well, I appreciate your time coming here to talk about Paul and about your experiences in the industry. And thank you, James, for being here with us on Between Two Ferals.
Excellent. Thank you.